Madding Crowd 1878 The Return of the Native 1886 The Mayor of Casterbridge 1887 The Woodlanders 1895 Jude the Obscure. See also, Frankenstein Wuthering Heights Bleak House Far from the Madding Crowd The Waste Land. In context. Focus aestheticism. Before 1884 in French writer Joris Karl Huysmans' Against Nature, the eccentric aesthete anti-hero, Jean de Essientes, loathes middle-class morality. After 1901 German novelist Thomas Manns Buddenbrooks details the decline of bourgeois culture in the 19th century. 1912 Thomas Mann's novella Death in Venice charts the succumbing to temptation of Gustav von Aschenbach, an artist who goes down a self-destructive path of erotic infatuation and excess. 1926 The novella Dream Story, by Austrian writer Arthur Schnitzler, is published. It is considered a key piece in the turn-of-the-century Viennese decadence movement that is associated with aestheticism. When the dandy Lord Henry I seduces the title character of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray into a life of debauchery, his advice to yield to temptation summarizes the basic tenets of aestheticism. The aesthetic movement developed in late 19th century Europe and Britain, emphasizing the primacy of art for art's sake rather than for its social, political, or moral value. In pursuit of pleasure. In Wilde's novel, the beautiful Dorian lives the life of the ideal aesthete, embracing all forms of hedonism in pursuit of new sensations. As he enters further into a life of dissipation and corruption, behind closed doors his magical portrait conceals the horrors of his sins, his painted image becoming older and uglier while he remains young and unblemished in the flesh. While the story is considered a prime example of the creed of appreciating art and life for sensual pleasure alone, Dorian's path of excess is a destructive one and he leaves many victims in his wake. His is not a straightforward tale of aesthetic pleasure, but, like the aesthetic movement, it questions the bourgeois morality of the 19th century, which required art to serve a higher purpose. Wilde's portrayal of aestheticism attacks this by suggesting that art should be removed from morality. Wilde saw his celebration of amoral sensuality and destruction as a critique of the middle-class ideology that, he felt, was stifling art with its didacticism. Beauty and decay. Just as Dorian superficially thrives while his painting decays, the facade of aestheticism disguised the loss of a middle-class social order in the waning of the British Empire. The beautiful decay that so fascinates Lord Henry represents the society from which it stems, where temptation is overly indulged as a symbol of a world in decline. Beauty might reign, but at a terrible cost. For Dorian, the ultimate price is his soul. See also, Death in Venice. In context. Focus Urban Gothic. Before 1852-53 in Charles Dickens' Bleak House, urban fog is used to signify claustrophobia and confusion. It becomes a key symbol of mystery and terror in urban Gothic fiction. 1886 The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, by Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson, puts a horrific spin on the tedium of middle-class decency. 1890 with its fixation on social degeneration and mortality, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Irish author Oscar Wilde is a classic urban Gothic novel. After 1909 French writer Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera takes the Gothic novel to the heart of Paris. Stage and film adaptations later bring the story to a huge audience. Stories of the supernatural and the macabre, set within ruins and wild landscapes, characterize the Gothic novel of the late 18th to early 19th centuries. The later urban Gothic novel turns city settings into places of horror, playing on the anxieties of the time, such as moral degeneration. Dracula, by the Irish novelist Abraham Stoker, takes the reader into the heart of Victorian London, where a vampiric foreign count threatens middle-class society. Living for the most part undetected, he is free to choose his victims. The novel reveals the horror that comes with urban anonymity. Horror from the East. Dracula is about East versus West. The Count comes from the East, lands on England's east coast, and resides in Purfleet, to the east of London. This, for the Victorian reader, would associate him with foreigners, violence, and crime. All that is modern, gas lights, science, technology, the police, is no help in the face of this ancient invader from lands of myth and folklore. Count Dracula is depicted as a foreign, dark, animalistic force. Contagion, sexuality, and degeneration, associated with the squalor of urban living, feature too, as the Count threatens to spread his curse of the undead. What manner of man is this, or what manner of creature is it in the semblance of a man? Dracula. See also, Bleak House, the picture of Dorian Gray, the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the turn of the screw. In context. Focus. Colonial literature before 1610, 11 Prospero enslaves Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest, one of the earliest fictional works to depict colonial attitudes. 1719 in Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe's hero teaches the native Friday the superior ways of the Western world. After 1924 E. M. Forster's A Passage to India questions whether there can ever be a true understanding between the colonizer and the colonized. 1930s The Negritude literary movement, led by M. Césaire and L. S. Senghor, rejects French colonial racism for a common black identity. 1990s The study of colonial representation in literature, postcolonialism, becomes popular in literary theory. During the 19th century, imperialism reigned supreme, and many European countries wielded immense power over their distant colonies. Western writers often held fiercely colonial attitudes, and the sense of superiority felt by the colonizing nation can be seen in novels of the period. But at the turn of the 20th century, colonialism, and its brutal effects on subjugated peoples, was starting to be questioned. Authors moved away from imperialist perspectives to explore the complexities of colonialism, and the rights and wrongs of empire. For example, Rudyard Kipling's work subtly challenges the image of the benevolent British Empire. But nowhere are the themes of colonial exploitation and intolerance seen more clearly in the literature of this era than in the works of Joseph Conrad, in particular in his short novel Heart of Darkness. Going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world. Heart of Darkness. The darkness within. Africa, the setting of the novel, was for Victorian Britain the Dark Continent. Conrad uses this image of darkness throughout the book. He refers, for example, to the River Thames leading out towards the heart of an immense darkness. Yet London was also one of the dark places of the earth. The novel suggests that this darkness can exist within as well as without. A white man operating beyond the confines of the European social system, such as the book's enigmatic ivory trader Kurtz, might begin to glimpse the darkness in his own soul. At the beginning of the novel, a group of friends sit in a boat moored in the Thames. One of them, Marlowe, tells the story of his time in the Belgian Congo, prefacing it with thoughts about what he calls the conquest of the earth, which is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Conquest relies on dispossession, on taking from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves. Marlowe's journey up the Congo reads like a voyage into hell, black Africans dying of overwork and malnutrition, white Europeans going slowly mad, his boat under attack from those who live in the jungle. He is obsessed with stories about Kurtz, who has amassed huge amounts of ivory but has embraced the darkness around him, or within him. The report that Kurtz has written about how to suppress savage customs ends, Marlowe discovers, with a scrawled sentence: exterminate all the brutes. Conrad here suggests that under the surface of the supposed mission to civilize Africa lies an urge to exterminate those of a different complexion. But just as Marlowe realizes his kinship with his cannibal crew, so he understands his kinship with Kurtz. Conrad, a contemporary of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, offers the suggestion that the heart of darkness may lie inside, that Marlowe's voyage deep into the African continent can be read as a voyage into the human psyche. Joseph Conrad. Joseph Conrad was born Józef Teodor Konrad Korseniowskis on December 3, 1857, in the Polish Ukraine. After his mother's early death and his father's political exile to Siberia, Conrad was brought up by his mother's brother in Krakow. At the age of 17, he moved to France and made many Bohemian friends. He took work at sea as a pilot, and his observations during this time laid the groundwork for much of the detail in his novels. Conrad later settled in England, with the intention of becoming a naval officer. He spent 20 years as a sailor, slowly learning English and beginning to write. He became a British subject in 1886 and began his first novel, Almayer's Folly, in 1889. The time he spent in command of a steamship named Le Roi de Belgies in the Belgian Congo in 1890 provided the outline for Heart of Darkness. Conrad died in 1924 at the age of 67. Other key works: 1900 Lord Jim, 1904 Nostromo, 1907 The Secret Agent, 1911 Under Western Eyes. See also, Robinson Crusoe, The Story of an African Farm, Nostromo, A Passage to India, Things Fall Apart. Further reading: A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens. One of only two historical novels written by the prolific English writer Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities is set in London and Paris before and during the 1789 French Revolution. Notable for its lack of humor, it tells the story of Dr. Manette, his granddaughter Lucy, her husband, émigré Charles Darnay, and Darnay's look-alike, Sidney Carton. Describing the plight of the peasantry, the storming of the Bastille, and the horrors of the guillotine, Dickens creates suspense when a long-buried secret is revealed, putting Darnay's life at risk. Great Expectations. Charles Dickens. One of Dickens' greatest critical and popular successes, Great Expectations opens on the misty Kent marshes where Pip, an orphan raised by a harsh sister and her kindly husband, blacksmith Joe Gargery, encounters an escaped convict. Time passes and Pip's life changes dramatically with news of great expectations from an anonymous benefactor, who enables him to become a gentleman. Written with perhaps the finest examples of Dickens' much-loved humor, the plot features many unforgettable characters: faded and embittered Miss Havisham, cold and haughty Estella, her adopted daughter, and convict Abel Magwitch. Ultimately, the discovery of his benefactor's identity turns Pip's life upside down. We need never be ashamed of shedding tears. They are rain on the blinding dust of earth. Great Expectations. Charles Dickens. Therese Raquin. Émile Zola. Initially serialized, Therese Raquin by French writer Zola tells the tragic story of the heroine, Therese. Unhappily married to her sickly cousin Camille, she embarks on a torrid love affair with Laurent, a friend of her husband's. The two lovers murder Camille, an act that haunts them for the rest of their lives, turning their passion to hatred. Remarkable for Zola's scientific study of temperament, the novel, which was criticized by some for being putrid, helped to establish him as a great writer. The Moonstone. Wilkie Collins. Described by T.S. Eliot as the first, the longest and the best of the modern English detective novel, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins concerns the mysterious theft of a priceless Indian diamond from an English country house. It utilizes the same method of multiple narrators that Collins had deployed to great effect in his earlier work The Woman in White. First published in serial form, the book established what would later become the classic detective novel elements: suspense, misleading clues and happenings, a bungling local policeman, a brilliant but idiosyncratic detective, false suspects, a locked room, and a dramatic denouement. Wilkie Collins. Born in London in 1824, the son of the landscape painter William Collins, Wilkie Collins discovered a gift for devising tales as a teenager while at boarding school, thanks to a bully who demanded a story before allowing him to sleep each night. He was introduced to Dickens in 1851 and became protégé to the literary colossus, with whom he collaborated and formed a close friendship that grew over the next 2 decades. In the 1860s Collins wrote his most celebrated and enduring works, becoming established as the pioneer of mystery stories and suspense fiction, a genre that later gave rise to the detective novel. He died in 1889 of a stroke. Key works: 1859, 60 The Woman in White, 1868 The Moonstone. Little Women. Louisa May Alcott. Originally published in 2 volumes, Little Women by U.S. author Alcott is set in New England during the U.S. Civil War of 1861-65. It traces the various activities and aspirations of 4 sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, as they develop into young women. The book was an enormous success on both sides of the Atlantic, establishing a genre that approached young womanhood in a new and modern way, rejecting traditional feminine roles. Alcott's characters, although sometimes seen as sentimental, are strong-minded women, particularly Jo, a tomboy who challenges conformity. The Idiot. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Writing The Idiot, considered to be one of the most brilliant works of Russia's literary golden age, writer and philosopher Dostoevsky intended to depict a completely beautiful human being. The result was Prince Mishkin, the protagonist and idiot of the novel, a nobleman with almost Christ-like compassion, but who is ultimately naive. Returning from a Swiss sanatorium, Mishkin finds himself torn between romantic love for Aglaya Yupankin and compassionate love for Nastasia Filipovna, a kept and oppressed woman. His goodness is tested, but ultimately there is no place for Mishkin's compassion and integrity in an increasingly corrupt society. A Sentimental Education. Gustave Flaubert. Set during the period of the 1848 Revolution and the ensuing Second French Empire of Napoleon III, A Sentimental Education by French novelist and playwright Flaubert recounts the activities of a young and somewhat rootless lawyer, Frédéric Moreau, and his infatuation with an older married woman, Madame Arnaud. Calling on events from his own life, Flaubert writes in a sparse, objective, and occasionally ironic style to create a realistic picture of bourgeois society that existed in France at the time, which he criticizes for its posturing and lack of refinement. They had both failed in their objects, the one who dreamed only of love, and the other of power. A Sentimental Education. Gustave Flaubert. 7 Brothers. Alexis Kivi. 10 years in the writing. 7 Brothers by Finnish writer Kivi describes the boisterous and often disastrous adventures of 7 brothers who, rejecting social conventions, escape into the forest to live as hunters. Combining romanticism, realism, and a great deal of humor, the novel was harshly received by critics, which may have contributed to Kivi's early death. Today it is regarded as a masterpiece and the first significant novel to be written in the Finnish language, breaking the dominance of Swedish literature in Finland. The Gaucho Martín Fierro. José Hernández. Largely social protest, The Gaucho Martín Fierro by Argentinian poet Hernández is an epic poem that describes the way of life of the gauchos, cattle ranchers whose traditional life on the grassy plains of the Pampas is threatened by industrialization and political manipulation. Through the poem, Martín Fierro, a payador, sings of his oppressed life and the starkness of the Pampas. Hernández championed the cause of the gauchos, and his poem, with its nostalgic view of a vanished life, was a literary and popular success. A Season in Hell. Arthur Rimbaud. Written by French prodigy Rimbaud at the age of just 19, A Season in Hell is a complex work of prose and verse that reflects the poet's tumultuous life. Arranged in 9 sections, the poem consists of scenes in which the narrator examines the hells through which he has traveled, mirroring Rimbaud's moral crisis and reflective state of mind following the breakdown of his relationship with his lover, the artist Paul Verlaine. The book was to prove an inspiration to the symbolist movement, and to future generations of poets and writers. Far from the Madding Crowd. Thomas Hardy. The English author's first popular success, and the first to be set in Wessex, Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy centers on Bathsheba Everdeen, an independent and bold woman who attracts 3 contrasting suitors, devoted shepherd Gabriel Oak, neighboring farmer Boldwood, and the dashing Sergeant Troy. Creating evocative descriptions of rural life, Hardy explores the themes of rejection, poverty, faithful love, and unprincipled passion. Anna Karenina. Leo Tolstoy. A novel described by Dostoevsky as flawless, Anna Karenina by Russian author Leo Tolstoy traces the adulterous liaison between Anna, the beautiful and intelligent wife of Alexei Karenin, and Count Vronsky, a young bachelor. Karenin discovers his wife's affair but, desirous of maintaining his public position, he refuses to divorce his wife. The lovers move to Italy, have a child, and live troubled lives. Having broken the social codes of the day, Anna is shunned by society. Running parallel to Anna's story is that of country landowner Levin, a character that Tolstoy based on himself, and Kitty, who is related to Anna by marriage and who was originally infatuated with Vronsky. Following a difficult courtship, Levin and Kitty ultimately have a happy and fulfilling marriage, reflecting Tolstoy's belief in the simple, pastoral life. Daniel Deronda. George Eliot. Daniel Deronda is the last work that English novelist Eliot completed. Notable for its exposure of anti-Semitism in Victorian Britain and its sympathetic treatment of Jewish ideals, the novel incorporates two strands. The first concerns Gwendolen Harleth, stifled and frustrated in an unhappy marriage. The second describes Daniel Deronda, a wealthy and compassionate man who, by rescuing a young Jewess, Mira Lapidoth, discovers his own Jewish roots. After Deronda and Gwendolen meet by chance, their lives begin to intertwine. Deronda's decision to support the Jewish cause enables Gwendolen to seek her own freedom. A Doll's House. Henrik Ibsen. A three-act play by Norwegian playwright, poet, and theater director Henrik Ibsen, A Doll's House sparked outrage and controversy when it was first performed. The play portrays an ordinary family, Torvald Helmer, a bank lawyer, his wife Nora, and their three children. However, the play also expresses Ibsen's critical opinion of conventional marriage when, after a serious disagreement with her husband, Nora leaves both him and their children to seek independence and self-fulfillment. Henrik Ibsen. Considered to be the father of realism and seen as one of the trailblazers of modernism in theater, Ibsen was born in Skien, southern Norway, in 1828. He began writing plays when he was 15, and was determined to make this his career. His play Brand gained him recognition, while the plays that followed, with their biting social realism, established him internationally. Most of his dramas are set in Norway, although he spent his most productive years, from 1868 onwards, working in Italy and Germany, returning to Norway in 1891 as a national hero. Following a series of strokes he died in 1906. Key works. 1879 A Doll's House 1881 Ghosts 1884 The Wild Duck 1890 Hedda Gabler 1892 The Master Builder. The Brothers Karamazov. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Some 2 years in the writing, The Brothers Karamazov by Russian writer Dostoevsky was the author's final novel, and is often considered to be his masterpiece. Recounted by an unnamed first-person narrator, the novel tells the story of irresponsible wastrel Fyodor Karamazov and his sons from two marriages, Dmitri, a hedonist, Ivan, a rationalist and atheist, Alyosha, a man of deep faith, and an illegitimate son, Smerdyakov, who is morose and epileptic. Describing family struggles over an inheritance, a love rivalry between Dmitri and Fyodor, and introducing the theme of patricide, Dostoevsky creates a complex novel in which he explores profound questions of faith and doubt, the problem of free will, and the issue of moral responsibility. Dostoevsky died within 4 months of the novel's completion. Treasure Island. Robert Louis Stevenson. First serialized in a children's magazine, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson is a masterpiece of children's literature, featuring pirates, buried treasure, and a swamp-ridden tropical island. Creating a gripping read that has entertained children around the world, Stevenson also interweaves a coming-of-age novel, as teenager Jim Hawkins gained sensitivity and maturity. The author also explores moral issues with his descriptions of the ever-changing character of one-legged pirate Long John Silver. The Story of an African Farm. Olive Schreiner. Feminist South African writer Olive Schreiner set the story of an African farm in the South African veldt, the grassy scrubland on which the region's Dutch settlers reared cattle, where she grew up. Reflecting her strongly held views, the novel features a young woman, Lyndall, who challenges the Bible-led restrictions of Boer society, and her suitor Waldo, who also rebels against convention. Schreiner's portrayal of Lyndall won her both